Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services online public input session on the landfill siting requirements in the New Hampshire Solid Waste Rules, which are primarily found in Part Env-Sw 804, Siting Requirements of the New Hampshire Code of Administrative Rules for Solid Waste Management. This public input session, including the associated comment period, is being held in advance of the formal rulemaking process to provide a broad opportunity for all interested parties to share their ideas and concerns regarding the solid waste landfill siting rules. Please note that there will be future opportunities to provide public comment through the formal rulemaking process. In addition to today's session, we encourage all attendees to submit comments in writing to DES before August 4th at 4 p.m. My name is Leah McKenna, and I am the Administrator of the Solid Waste Management Bureau in the Waste Management Division of the Department of Environmental Services, and I'll be moderating this public input session. Please note that during this session, we may refer to the department as the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, NHDES, or DES. The agenda for this meeting is shown on the slide. First, I'll introduce the team we have here today and provide some guidance on using the GoToWebinar software. Then we'll hear from Jamie Colby, who will give us a brief description of the existing solid waste rules and present ideas the department is considering for rule changes. This will be followed by an opportunity for public input, and this meeting will end no later than 4 p.m. today. I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to the team that we have supporting this public input session. Today we have Michael Wimsatt, Director of the Waste Management Division. From the Solid Waste Management Bureau, we have Jamie Colby and Emily Jones. In addition, assisting us in running the software for this meeting are Tara Albert of the Solid Waste Management Bureau and Jean Ronigan from the Department of Information Technology. We're going to ask that you reach out to Jean Ronigan if you have technical difficulties with the GoToWebinar software. As previously stated, the purpose of today's public input session is to provide a broad opportunity for all interested parties to share their ideas and concerns regarding the landfill siting rules in advance of DES's work to draft proposed rule amendments. This public input session is not required by statute or rule, but we wanted to provide an informal opportunity for the public to ask questions and propose ideas regarding the siting requirements prior to starting the formal rulemaking process. Once the formal rulemaking process starts, we will propose specific rule language on which the public can comment. We do not have specific proposed rule language at this time, just ideas under consideration. As noted on the slide, Chapter Env-Sw 800, the Landfill Requirements chapter, within which the majority of the landfill siting requirements are identified, is set to expire on July 1st, 2024. So to ensure readoption of this chapter before it expires, DES will soon start drafting proposed language. I'd like to note before we continue that a public input session on the other parts of Chapter Env-Sw 800 was held by DES back in March, and a memo containing a link to the recording of that session and all of the other public input sessions we've held is available in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar dashboard. All participants joining us online have the opportunity to listen and will be able to speak when invited through the GoToWebinar platform. Telephone-only participants will not be able to provide input verbally because the GoToWebinar platform does not see you unless you are logged into the software. However, all participants are encouraged to submit written comments in accordance with the notice for this public input session. At this time, I'm going to provide an introduction to the GoToWebinar platform that we are using for this meeting. When you are logged into GoToWebinar, you will see an orange rectangle with a white arrow, typically found in the upper right corner of your screen. Clicking this arrow will show the GoToWebinar dashboard. The dashboard has a section titled Audio, where you can make adjustments to your audio settings, and a section titled Handouts, where you can download a copy of the notice for this public input session, a copy of today's presentation slides, the Chapter Env-Sw rules as they currently are, and a memorandum containing links to the previous public input sessions on DES's current solid waste rule readoption efforts. You can also use the raise hand function if you need the attention of the software manager. On the slide I am showing, you will see a questions section. This is where you will enter your name if you have a comment or question when it is time for the public to provide input. As of now, that is turned off and will be enabled later. I will repeat these instructions again when we open the floor for public input. Right now, all online attendees are muted with no video feed, and you should be able to see and hear me. Online attendees will remain in this state until we open the floor for input. If you need assistance with GoToWebinar, we have Jean Ronigan of DOIT standing by to help. I will read her phone number and email address now, and her contact information will be posted on the screen intermittently through the session. You can reach Jean by phone at area code 603-271-8740 or by email at jean.m.ronigan, jean.m.ronigen @doit.nh.gov. Now, Jamie will provide a brief introduction to the existing solid waste rules. Jamie will then outline multiple proposed rule concepts or ideas under consideration by DES for Part Env-Sw 804, the landfill siting requirements. Jamie?
Thank you, Leah. Good afternoon, everyone. As Leah stated, my name is Jamie Colby. I'm supervisor of the Engineering and Permitting section in the Solid Waste Management Bureau at DES. I would like to start by briefly explaining how the existing solid waste rules are laid out, and then I'll move on to present several ideas the department is considering relative to the landfill siting rules. The solid waste rules interpret and implement the requirements in RSA 149M, the Solid Waste Management Act. These rules effectively instruct DES and parties interested in solid waste management how to carry out the requirements in the statute. As such, the rules tend to be much more detailed than the statute, as they need to provide more concrete how-to information. It is important to understand a bit about the structure of New Hampshire solid waste rules. The solid waste rules are layered, like a pyramid, one on top of another. For those of you who have attended previous public input sessions, this pyramid should look familiar. At the base of our pyramid, we have rules about definitions, processes, and procedures. These are rules that describe how to implement the solid waste program and permitting system required by statute. On top of that foundation, we have rules applicable to all solid waste facilities. These are known as the universal facility requirements. For example, all solid waste facilities are required to be operated in a manner that controls, to the greatest extent practicable, litter, odor, and noise. On top of the universal requirements, we have rules applicable only to permitted facilities. These are known as the additional facility requirements. For example, all permitted facilities are required to file annual reports. On top of the additional requirements, we have rules regarding financial assurance. Financial assurance is money set aside for the state to use in the event a permittee is unable to permanently close a facility or perform post-closure care of a facility. This scenario might arise if, for example, a permittee goes bankrupt. Finally, we have rules about specific types of solid waste facilities, like the landfill rules. Note that there are only 3 types of solid waste facilities: collection, storage, and transfer facilities, where waste comes in and waste goes out; processing and treatment facilities, where waste comes in and a product and a waste go out; and landfills, where waste comes in and waste stays. This afternoon, we are specifically seeking input on requirements for landfill siting. The organization of the landfill requirements rule chapter is shown on the slide. This is chapter Env-Sw 800. On the slide, you can see the chapter parts are numbered Env-Sw 801 through 810. Today, we are specifically focusing on part Env-Sw 804, the landfill siting requirements. I would note, however, that the landfill design requirements also include elements some may find relevant to the siting requirements, such as landfill liner design standards, which would be found in part Env-Sw 805. A copy of chapter Env-Sw 800 is available in the handout section of the GoToWebinar dashboard. The organization of the landfill siting requirements in Part Env-Sw 804 is shown on this slide. We'll go into these sections in more detail in a minute, but generally Env-Sw 804 includes applicability requirements, groundwater and surface water protection standards, setback requirements, and geologic and other siting limitation requirements. Because there's been a lot of discussion and some confusion about New Hampshire's landfill siting requirements, I am going to take some time to walk through and discuss each section in this part. The existing rule language regarding applicability of this landfill siting requirements is shown on the slide. Generally, landfills that were sited prior to 2005 are grandfathered and are not required to comply with these siting requirements. Facilities permitted under an approval other than a standard permit are also exempt from the landfill siting requirements. That does not mean that these facilities have no siting requirements, simply that their siting requirements are found elsewhere in the rules. In Env-Sw 804.02, the rules address groundwater protection standards. Generally, these standards can be thought of as consisting of two parts: site-specific requirements and minimum setback requirements. Items A and D in this part address minimum setbacks. That is, a landfill shall not be sited within a wellhead protection area of a community or non-community, non-transient water supply well, and the base of the bottommost liner in a landfill shall be a minimum of 6 feet above the seasonal high groundwater table and the confirmed bedrock surface. Those are minimum setback or siting requirements relative to groundwater protection. Items B and C, on the other hand, address site-specific groundwater setback or siting requirements. Item B requires that a landfill and all associated leachate storage units be located only in areas where groundwater monitoring for release detection, characterization, and remediation can be conducted prior to release having an adverse effect on a water supply. And item C requires that identification of that area noted in item B be based on a hydrogeologic investigation, which provides site-specific information required to model the pre-construction and post-construction groundwater and surface water regimes at a site. Those are the site-specific requirements relative to groundwater protection. So you can see, again, A and D have minimum setback requirements, B and C have site-specific requirements. And we'll see this model carry forward. The surface water protection standards in Env-Sw 804.03 can be similarly grouped into minimum setbacks and site-specific requirements. Items B and C are site-specific, requiring that a landfill and all associated leachate storage units be located only in areas where potential adverse effects to surface water quality can be prevented or minimized and mitigated by facility design. An identification of these areas shall be based on a thorough hydrogeological investigation. Those are the site-specific surface water protection requirements. Items A and D on this slide are minimum setback requirements. Item A refers to RSA 485A, which is a statute about water pollution and waste disposal, and which statute makes it unlawful to place solid waste in surface water. Item D requires that the footprint of a landfill not be located within 200 feet of any perennial surface water body. These minimum surface water setback requirements continue in items E, F, and G. Item E requires that the footprint of a landfill not be located within 200 feet up gradient and 100 feet down gradient of a wetland. This one's a little tricky, but basically means that a wetland located up gradient of the landfill must be at least 100 feet away from the landfill footprint, and a wetland located down gradient of the landfill must be at least 200 feet away from landfill footprint. Item F requires that the footprint of a landfill not be located within 1,000 feet up gradient of a surface water reservoir or intake used for a community drinking water supply. And item G requires that a landfill not be located within the 100-year floodplain. So items A, D, E, F, and G are minimum setback requirements, and items B and C are site-specific requirements relative to surface water protection. Whichever of these requirements is more stringent, the site-specific requirements or the minimum setback requirements, will be the requirements that govern where a landfill may be sited. There are additional siting requirements in the rules. Env-Sw 804.04 has minimum setback requirements from property lines, roads, residential properties, and airports. I would note here that these requirements apply in addition to any federal requirements that might be more strict. For example, regarding airports, there are certain very specific types of airports where a landfill must be sited at least 6 miles away from the airport, according to federal regulations. Again, whichever is more stringent, the federal regulations or the state regulations, are going to apply to landfill siting. Finally, we have geologic and other siting limitations. The geologic limitations basically say you can't site a landfill where the ground is potentially unstable. The other siting limitation requires that a new landfill only be sited on property which is owned by the permittee. Those are the landfill siting requirements in Part Env-Sw 804, which are specific to landfills. However, recall that the solid waste rules are layered. Think of that pyramid we talked about. This means that there are siting requirements in other parts of the solid waste rules that are also applicable to landfills. These siting requirements can be found in chapters Env-Sw 1000, the Universal Facility Requirements, and Env-Sw 1100, the Additional Facility Requirements. I'm not going to go through all of these requirements, but I do want to briefly discuss the requirements relative to groundwater and surface waters, wetlands, shoreline protection, and designated rivers. The universal siting requirements effectively summarize which statutes other than the Solid Waste Management Act, RSA 149M, include references to solid waste facilities. Relative to management and protection of rivers, including designated rivers, RSA 483 addresses setbacks from different types of rivers, generally requiring that a new landfill or expansion of an existing landfill not be located in the designated river corridor or within 100 feet of the landward extent of the 500-year floodplain, whichever is greater. And there must be vegetative screening between the river and the landfill. Relative to protection of groundwater, RSAs 485, 485A, and 485C generally make it unlawful to place waste in surface waters and prohibit locating a landfill in the wellhead protection area where groundwater is classified as GAA, which is a groundwater quality designation, meaning the most protected class of groundwater in New Hampshire. RSA 485C also states that a groundwater release detection permit is required for a lined solid waste landfill. A groundwater release detection permit requires a permittee to monitor on-site groundwater quality for the purpose of early detection of impacts to groundwater from a particular activity, in this case from operation of a landfill. Relative to RSA 482A, relative to wetlands, does not have specific landfill siting requirements. However, if a potential wetland impact is to occur due to a new landfill construction, the wetland requirements may be applicable. RSA 483B, relative to shoreland protection, generally prohibits solid waste disposal, that is the footprint of a landfill, within a protected shoreland and within 250 feet of the reference line of a public water. The takeaway from all of this discussion, I hope, is that landfill siting is complicated, and rightly so. The solid waste rules do identify both minimum setback and site-specific requirements for siting a landfill. Further, the rules identify other statutes that also establish minimum setbacks for landfill siting. One last note, because this also tends to come up during landfill siting discussions, there are minimum landfill design requirements that may be relevant to landfill siting. In New Hampshire, municipal solid waste landfills, the ones that accept our household waste, are required to be double-lined. This means the landfill has two liner systems, a primary liner and a secondary liner. This also means the landfill has a primary leachate collection system and a secondary leak detection system. Further, there are minimum subgrade requirements for landfills. The subgrade for a landfill cannot have a hydraulic conductivity greater than 1 × 10⁻⁴ centimeters a second, which is about 100 feet per year. This would be something like a very fine-grained or silty sand where the drainage properties are considered poor and the permeability is considered low. Now, let's move on to the ideas under consideration by DES relative to updating the landfill siting rules. As previously presented in March of this year, DES is considering expanding the applicability of setback requirements for landfill infrastructure. Most of the siting requirements in landfill rules currently relate to landfill footprint. DES is considering expanding those requirements to also address setbacks for leachate management infrastructure and stormwater ponds, for example. DES is considering revising the setback requirements for wetlands and surface waters. The idea is to continue to have site-specific and minimum setback requirements, but to consider adjustments in keeping with current science and practices. DES is also considering revisions to the setback requirements for residential properties and adding a setback requirement for sensitive populations such as schools. DES is considering clarifying and revising the setback required between a landfill footprint and the property line or boundary of the parcel on which the landfill is located. And the department is considering clarifying the applicability of the setback requirements, specifically with regards to new facilities and expansion of existing facilities. We just covered a lot of information very quickly. Remember, you can download these slides from the handout section in your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we plan to post them to the solid waste webpage on the DES website within the next few days. We'll also post a recording of this presentation on the DES website and DES's YouTube channel. The rules and the solid waste statute are available online through either the DES website or the state legislature's website. Links to those are included on the last slide in this presentation, which you can download through the dashboard. Thank you for listening. I really hope this presentation has helped provide some context for the types of changes DES considering for the landfill siting rules, and has perhaps inspired more ideas that you can share with us. We would really appreciate comments and ideas supported by technical information and peer-reviewed articles. Also helpful would be information identifying other states' landfill siting requirements, including the rule reference or statutory citation for their requirements. Thank you again. Leah?
Thank you, Jamie. In a few moments, we will take a break. However, I would like to go over the ground rules for providing public input first. Our objective this afternoon is to give everyone who wishes to speak a reasonable opportunity to do so. After you have provided your name in accordance with the instructions, I will call on people to speak in the order displayed on the screen. Based on the number of attendees that we have with us today, I request that you limit your time to 4 minutes. Please graciously yield the floor within 4 minutes so that I can call the next speaker in line. We are frequently asked whether a speaker can yield their time to another speaker of their choice. This practice will not be allowed during this session, but instead we intend to proceed through the list of names to give everyone the time they need to provide their comment. So in other words, the person to whom you might wish to yield your time will have plenty of opportunity to provide input. They will just need to add their name into the question box and wait for their turn in line. When I call your name, if you decide you do not wish to speak at that time, please let me know and we will place your name at the end of the list to be called on after all other speakers have cycled through. Written comments may be submitted in writing to DES at any time before August 4th, 2023 at 4 p.m. instead of or in addition to providing comments at this public input session. Please submit comments using either DES's mailing address or by email at swmbrules@des.nh.gov. Please note there will be future opportunities to provide public comment during the formal rulemaking process. Please listen closely to the following instructions on how to provide oral comments using GoToWebinar. And as a reminder, these instructions are not applicable to our telephone-only attendees who are in listen-only mode. For oral comments, we will enable the GoToWebinar question function. Using this function, you will let DES know that you would like to provide input by entering your full name into the GoToWebinar question box. The information typed in the question box is not your public comment, and you should not type anything substantive in this box. In order to be added to the list to provide oral comments, you must enter your name. If you are a state senator or representative and would like to be called upon early in the queue, please alert us by writing senator or representative before your name, and we will attempt to put you up front in the queue to speak. Please note, when you are unmuted and speaking, DES and all other attendees will hear you, but your video feed will not be transmitted. Tara, would you please enable the question function and confirm with us that it is available to attendees?
It is available.
Thank you, Tara. Everyone should now see the question box in the GoToWebinar dashboard. If you want to provide testimony, please type your name in the question box and then hit enter to submit. We will be monitoring the list of attendees who are submitting this information and will place your name in the queue. Remember that if you need technical assistance with getting onto the list to provide comments, Jean Ronigan is available by phone at area code 603-271-8740 or by email at jeaning.rongen@doit.nh.gov. We will now take a short break to enter names on the list, and we will be back in 5 minutes. So that will be 1:32. Welcome back, everyone. As I mentioned earlier, our objective this afternoon is to give everyone who wishes to speak a reasonable opportunity to do so. If your comments will not fit inside the allotted time of 4 minutes, you are welcome to enter your name again in the question box to speak at the end of the queue. Also, we ask that everyone remain respectful of one another. There may be differing viewpoints represented by the participants of this session, and issues can be emotionally charged. In all cases, I ask that all participants honor the process of being able to hold a public input session to hear differing viewpoints and concerns by extending each other courtesy and civility. We will begin hearing public input at this time. I ask that both Mike Wimsatt and Jamie Colby turn on their cameras to be available. I will call on individuals one at a time. When called on, please ensure that your microphone is not muted and begin your comments by stating your name. I see we have folks who have indicated that they would like to provide comments. Our first person will be Elliot Wessler, and then we have Dr. Adam Finkel. Mr. Wessler, when I turn the floor over to you, please start by stating your name. You have the floor for a 4-minute period.
My name is Elliot Wessler. I live in Whitefield, New Hampshire. I have participated in at least one of the other webinars that DES has done over the last couple of months. And frankly, I'm a little surprised and disappointed in that the Section 300 webinar, there is quite a bit more information about what specific ideas DES has in terms of revising its rules. You have indicated you've identified the parts of your rules that you're considering revising, but you didn't say anything about what your thinking is about revising it. So it's frankly a little bit hard to comment on what you've did. So rather than do what you're thinking, rather than do that, I'd like to pose a couple of kind of general questions. And my first question is about what happens in the interim period between now and when new revised rules are likely to be implemented, which is, if I understand correctly, about a year from now. Is GSL has indicated that it's on several occasions, including in the press, just in the last couple of days, that it's very likely to file permit applications within the next couple of weeks. So the basic question is, it's hard for me to believe that GSL has not had conversations with DES about whether their application will be grandfathered under the rules that exist at the time that they file their application, or whether they will be subject to any revised rules. Can you tell us what discussions you've had with DES on this point? Another part of my question is, can you tell us what legal analysis DES has undertaken, what contacts you've made with the Attorney General's office to discuss the issue of grandfathering, the legality of it? And finally, I'd like to ask, holding aside any legalities, is there anybody at DES on the panel, for example, that thinks, aside from the legalities, that allowing an applicant to file a permit during this interim period before the new rules are in effect would be a service to, and have those existing rules apply to that permit application, that's in the interest of the people in the state of New Hampshire?
Sure, I'll take those. Thank you, Mr. Wessler. My name is Mike Wimsatt. I serve as Director of the Waste Division for DES. And as to your first question about whether DES has had any discussions about what the status of relative to grandfathering would be for any applications submitted, we've not had any discussions about that with Casella or anybody else. That is certainly something we've thought about in the wake of recent events. We've not consulted with the AG about that specifically yet. That my understanding from my time and experience here is that is not always a simple legal question. It is very specific to circumstances of a particular application and where the rules are at and such. So I don't have a good answer for you on that, other than that we will obviously, if we are presented with an application, and that this goes to your other question, we will be bound to review that application consistent with existing law and rules relative to how we process applications, and certainly understanding what, depending on timing, what rules might apply to that. If and you're right, we expect to propose rules around the first of the year and begin with an initial rulemaking notice that would then launch the typical process, which includes public hearing and comment period, with an eye towards meeting our deadline of readopting rules, readopting the whole chapter 800 with whatever amendments are proposed by July 1 of 2024. And so, how that might intersect with or impact, or any changes that are made might intersect with or impact a pending decision is really not clear to us at this point, and it's something we'll be certainly looking to understand when the time comes.
Thank you, Mr. Wessler. If you have follow-up questions, please feel free to put your name in the questions box again, and we can add you again to the queue. Next, we will hear from Dr. Adam Finkel, and then we have Clark Corson. Dr. Finkel, please unmute yourself, state your name.
Hi, Adam Finkel. I hope I'm audible. Thank you for putting this on. I've done some advance notices of proposed rulemaking in my day, and they're very helpful. I really do appreciate it. I think we could have used more substance, as Elliot said, and a little more notice than 8 days, but nevertheless, it's very helpful to be able to weigh in at this point. I hope DES is upbeat about this, as I am. With the end of the legislative session, I think you now are in a position to revise these rules the normal, accepted, transparent, efficient way that all other states do it. Marry your considerable in-house expertise with that of all the highly trained scientists in the state and elsewhere available to you, and take policy advice from all the affected constituents, including those whose salaries don't depend on offering only advice that might please their employers or their clients. We had a bill in the Senate that would have given one person or firm the keys to the state policy and drowned out other voices, and so I think we're all glad to be now back on a level playing field. I've got many things I could say, and maybe I can come back at the end with a couple more specifics, but really I think the way I hope to be most helpful is to talk briefly about helping, at least giving one perspective on what is the difference between the science components of this effort and the policy components. I think the biggest mistake you could make in a rulemaking like this is to be fooled into thinking that you have to, quote, follow the science, when in fact what you're going to be fed is a series of personal value judgments, which is as it should be. But to oversimplify, almost all of what remains for you guys to do is policy and value choice. So you'll be hearing different value choices today and in the next 18 months or 12 months, as it should be. But it is your job, along with the legislature, to make the hard choices, and you should not claim that the science made us do it. If somebody wants to dispute this analogy, go ahead, but I really think that setting this a reasonable setback to surface water and other valuable assets is exactly like setting a speed limit for state highways. We know exactly how to measure how fast a car is going, just as we've known for decades exactly how to measure how fast groundwater moves at any given point in space. All the rest involves deciding how to balance safety and convenience, and whether and how to give out special privileges. We could set a speed limit that will reduce fatalities without compromising convenience, or we could make a mistake and impose one that will increase fatalities. So I think you're basically going to hear some people say in this process, I will give the sort of environmental equivalent of this speed limit prescription disguised as science. And I'm hypothesizing and quoting here. Quote, we surveyed a bunch of people handpicked by us, and we have, quote unquote, found the average driver can safely drive at 90 miles an hour. And oh yeah, we should add 20 more miles per hour to the speed limit for those drivers who have an extra mirror on the side of their car. And we should add 20 more for those drivers who can sign a form saying that they think they're excellent drivers and nothing can go wrong with their driving.
1 minute, Dr. Finkel.
Okay, so if I get another chance, I have literally 7 one-sentence recommendations. But I think your choice in the year ahead is to end up with a rule that basically says, without being honest about it, either any landfill can be built anywhere or no landfill can be built anywhere. And what we need is one that says the vast majority of tracts are acceptable, but a few tracts are unacceptable. And I think we had that in the House bill, and I hope you will create a rule that, if not mirrors that, at least tries to follow that prescription. We are trying only to rule out the least appropriate minority of tracts in the state that simply should not be proposed and should certainly not be permitted. Thanks.
And Dr. Finkel, if you have 7 items, of course, please feel free to put your name up again, but we would definitely want to see anything that you were suggesting sent to us in writing via swmbrules@des.nh.gov, just as a reminder for you and everyone. Thank you for your comments. I see next we have Representative Germana, and then we will have Clark Corson. Representative Germana, please unmute your microphone.
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's a great, as Dr. Finkel was saying, it's a great opportunity to kind of get this process going, and I appreciate Director Wimsatt taking my question. And this is connected to Mr. Wessler's question in the beginning. I totally understand it's not a straightforward answer when we get into the legal issues, but we're not going to need, by all accounts, a new landfill in the state of New Hampshire for at least 20 years. And we can extend that further by doing some of the things that we should be doing. So when it comes to processing a permit, if somebody puts in a permit application next week or next month, we're in the middle of a rule writing process. We have consensus across the board that the current rules are no longer adequate. To what extent is need going to be taken into account? If we don't need a landfill for 20 years, I understand that the current rules are what the current rules are, but in the midst of rule writing, how would the fact that we don't need a landfill for at least 20 years, how would that shape the process of considering a permit under the current rules, since we are now in the process of writing new rules?
Representative Germana, did I hear you address that question to Director Wimsatt?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, yes.
That's okay. Mike, I believe you are muted.
Sorry about that. We'll try that again. Good afternoon, Representative Germana. It's nice to hear from you. Yeah, thank you for that question. So I guess the short answer is that a party has a right to submit an application, and we have a responsibility to review that application consistent with the rules and the law. With regard to need, part of the evaluation that we make whenever we receive an application for expansion or a new landfill is that applicant needs to demonstrate that the facility that's proposed will provide a public benefit. And as part of making that demonstration, the applicant's required to evaluate the availability of capacity in the state for waste that the facility would receive over a 20-year planning period. So any application that we get will be required to analyze capacity need during the 20-year planning period, and we would review that as part of our review to make a decision on any application that's before us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Germana. Next, we have Clark Corson and followed by Cheryl Jensen. Mr. Corson, please unmute your microphone. You have 4 minutes.
How about now?
Gotcha.
Okay, thank you. To Director Wimsatt, we've had previous conversations, and I'm very grateful that you're who you are and heading up the solid waste department, because you've got a sense of levity and balance that is going to be required going forward. With respect to Elliot and Dr. Finkel's comments and that of Representative Germana, everyone in DES has to understand that when it became evident to the legislature and the general public, due to printed media and so forth, that the private landfills in particular in New Hampshire were thriving on nearly 50% of out-of-state trash to make their operations economically feasible, that was a wake-up call to a number of people in New Hampshire who wondered who was running the show. Was it the governor? Was it a past governor? Was it the legislature? Was it DES? Was it the failure of the public to elect people who were genuinely concerned? So I just want you to understand that there is a level of skepticism when it comes to landfill setbacks, myself being one of them, totally notwithstanding the Dalton situation. So what I've done is, and I have to thank Leah for helping me do this, is I've researched landfill setbacks in contiguous states. And I can tell you Vermont, for example, has the length of a football field. It's 300 feet. Whereas Maine has 100 feet, but it's 1,000 feet if it's a running stream of water. So there are all sorts of contingencies and caveats and carve-outs and so forth. I would just ask you and the department going forward with these hearings that you're going to publish soon, that you consider preventive measures and err on the side of caution versus the word remediation, which I really don't like. It's so much easier to take care of something up front rather than chase it after. So I appreciate you giving me the time. I'm very interested in what others have to say, and thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Next, I see we have Representative Linda Haskins. Representative Haskins, please unmute your microphone. You have 4 minutes.
Hi, thank you very much for taking my question. I want to speak to how a member like myself came to understand a little bit more about how landfills are sited. I am not a scientist, but I am an environmentalist. And I think there is a growing groundswell of people who are now paying attention to the kinds of decisions that they felt was beyond their purview previously, but are recognizing that these decisions affect us all. So I am part of a burgeoning environmental caucus in the legislature. And we recognize now our responsibility when it comes to monitoring the kinds of issues that will affect the safety of our citizens, because that is, after all, our responsibility as legislators. So I don't have a particular question for Director Wimsatt, although like previous speakers, I see no earthly reason why a permit should be acted on when we have the time to pull in some of these local experts, one of whom is on this call, to get the information that we need so that we don't make a mistake. There's an awful lot of pressure by industry, and I do understand that. But I think what I'm hearing and seeing among the environmentalists in the caucus, that we also have greater responsibility than we had even understood previously. So we intend to shepherd this process as is our right, and we intend to get the people who are most impacted by these decisions to get their voices heard. Whatever we can do to help that is what we expect to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comments, Representative Haskins. Next, we have Cheryl Jensen, followed by Adam Finkel. Cheryl, please unmute yourself, and you have 4 minutes.
I believe Can you hear me? I believe I have unmuted myself. Thank you
You are
very
good.
much. Okay, I hope to be clear because I've changed my question a number of times while sitting here. My concern is ethical and not legal. Of course, I saw the article in the Concord Monitor in which Mr. Wimsatt was quoted as thinking it was not unethical to run language on SB 61 by Casella Waste because you run information by many constituents. But Casella is a company that makes money on landfilling. So my question is, going forward with the changes to the siting, how much weight is DES going to give to input from Casella Waste on these rule changes versus the input that it might get from people like Elliot Wessler and Adam Finkel? Question mark.
Sure. Good afternoon, Cheryl. Thanks for the question. So, yeah, the very simple answer is that the agency has a long history and will continue to interact with all parties who have an interest in legislation. And of course, in New Hampshire, anyone and everyone can and often does have an interest in a piece of legislation. We don't necessarily assign a weight from one party to another. We listen to what's being provided. At the end of the day, when we propose rules, we will propose rules that we believe will be protective of the environment, will help us achieve our mission, and will strike a balance between all the various responsibilities that the agency has. And, I understand, I want to just say, I understand why people are frustrated and concerned that the agency had communications with the industry with respect to this bill. I understand why they would feel that way. What I will tell you is that whenever there is a bill before the legislature that affects any body, whether it's an individual or a small business or a big business, all those parties are going to weigh in, and that's how as I understand it, and as I have always understood it, is the way that legislation is supposed to be made. All the parties who have an interest get an opportunity to know what's being presented, to comment on it. The agency in its role in the executive branch is often asked by legislators and others to provide assistance in looking at language or in drafting language. And in the case of this particular bill that you're referring to, we did all those things. We had, it is true that Casella provided in late January to me some specific recommendations for changes, which I commented on and shared those comments with them and others. Also, the North Country Alliance for Balanced Change came to us very early in the process, before the legislative session even started, and asked us to help write a bill that became Senate Bill 227. We essentially drafted that bill at their request. That was a bill that they thought would be helpful. In the end, Senate Bill 227 got incorporated into Senate Bill 61, and they ran together as Senate Bill 61. So we had example in that very bill of talking with parties, all different sides of the issue, and trying to get to what everyone's always trying to do in the legislature, which is get a bill that everybody can agree to and that will pass and that will accomplish what folks think is best for the people of the state. That bill didn't pass, and that's that. But at some level, if people think that the agency can only talk to people who agree with their side of the issue or their particular viewpoint, and that's the agency doing its job, but if it talks to others who have a differing opinion that that's unethical, then I don't know how to do my job, because I always talk to everybody who has a dog in the fight with respect to bills, who wants to talk to me. And at the end of the day, we may not agree on anything. We might not recommend or support anything that's said, or we may recommend and support it all. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is make sure that the agency achieves its mission of protecting human health and the environment. And that's what we did in this case, what we try to do with all of our bills. And I'm sympathetic. I understand people think I shouldn't talk to the industry about a bill like this, but that's just not a realistic view of how legislation gets made in the state. We can't pick and choose who we speak with when it comes to legislation. We certainly pick and choose where we're going to be on it, but we can't pick and choose who we communicate with, or when we're asked by a legislator to provide technical assistance, we're going to do that. So, it's maybe more than you wanted to hear on it, but I know there's been a lot said and written, and I really was hoping to clear the air on that.
Thank you, Ms. Jensen, for your question. If you have another question, please feel free to enter your name again if you'd like to ask another question. I'd like to move on now to John Swan, who is the next person who has not had a chance to speak. So, Mr. Swan, please unmute your microphone, state your name, and you have 4 minutes.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Thank you. Thank you for taking my question/comment. My question is a little different in that I've been examining the various groundwater monitoring reports from the NCS landfill in Bethlehem. And I guess my question would be, would DES, based on those reports, would you determine that the NCS landfill is releasing PFAS and dioxane into the surrounding environment, or not, based on the groundwater monitoring reports that I've seen, especially since 2017, when PFAS was added to the list of testing at NCES. But does DES, do you feel there's contaminants being released into the environment at NCES or not, based on those reports? Thank you.
Mr. Swan, I think that question goes beyond the scope of the intent of this public input session. But if you have specific questions relative to results, we would welcome the opportunity to have a conversation. I just don't think that anyone on this call would be prepared to engage on that topic at the moment.
Can I follow up on that then?
You sure can.
Okay, I guess my question would be, based on the solid waste rules that you're revising, what would be the course of action for DES to determine that a landfill is releasing contaminants into the environment in violation of its solid waste permit?
I'll take that one, Leah. I'm not sure that, under the current rules, we have a process for monitoring landfills and any potential releases that may occur from them. I'm not sure that I guess I'm not really understanding what your question is relative to any change in any upcoming change in the rules.
Well, at what point then, I guess, would DES determine that a landfill is operating unsafely relative to the environment, the surrounding environment? What's the threshold for realizing that a landfill is not operating safely? Is there a threshold?
Well, in general, if you're talking about the way that we monitor landfills, as I think you know, because you've inquired about this rather extensively, but for the benefit of others, all landfills are required to have groundwater monitoring under what's called a groundwater release detection permit that Jamie mentioned in her presentation. And that includes a network of monitoring wells that are right up close to the landfill footprint, so that we can get early detection of any releases. And then under that, there's periodic monitoring that's required, and sampling and analysis of the groundwater from those wells for a suite of contaminants. And then and geochemical parameters. And as we review that data on a real-time basis as it comes in, if we identify any changes in background concentrations of those contaminants or those parameters, then we are put on alert at that point, and then we require the party to go into what's called assessment monitoring, which typically means monitoring on a greater frequency along with a larger suite of contaminants that may be determined based on what we've seen in the data. And then basically there's an expectation that that assessment monitoring will be used to determine what's happened, what's going on, why there's a change in the geochemistry of the water and the groundwater quality. And then, you know, in a case where it's determined that there's a leak from the landfill, then there's a requirement to repair that. And if it can't be repaired, it would be required that that particular cell of the landfill be closed, capped. So it's kind of hard to speak about in the abstract, but as we review data, our goal is to make sure that the landfill is capturing any contaminants through leachate collection, and that no contaminants are getting into the environment as a result of the operation of the landfill.
Thank you, Mr. Swan, for your question and comment. If you have more, please feel free to enter your name into the question box and we can add you again to the queue. Next, I see we have Representative James Creighton. Representative Creighton, please unmute yourself and you have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. I just want to thank DES for putting on this open discussion that anyone can participate in. I wanted to comment on the concept that for some reason people disagree with reaching out to a wide variety of people, specifically Kinsella. And I can just imagine myself standing in front of the committee and determining who could come into the committee and listen to the comments and who could not. I think the beauty of our system is that we listen to everyone. We weigh those opinions and then we make assessments. But I think the concept that if for some reason DES or ENA for that matter would limit who we talk to, I think that definitely would lessen the viability and the quality of work that's done. So I applaud DES for reaching out to a wide variety of folks. You might not agree with all of them, but at least everyone has an opportunity to put their input in. Thanks, Lee, for putting this on. I appreciate it. Good work.
Representative Creighton, you mentioned ENA for those folks on this call. That is the Environment and Agriculture Committee.
That's correct. Thank you.
All right, sure, no problem. Next, we have Dr. Adam Finkel. Please unmute, state your name, and you have 4 minutes.
Sure, Adam Finkel again. Well, I appreciate the chance to go a second time. I will send this in writing. I would just like to get through literally 7 one-sentence recommendations, but I'm sorry, I do have to now talk about the issue. No one has ever objected to the fact of DES reaching out or being reached out to and communicating with everyone. That is your job. That was my job at the federal level. But there's a huge difference between bringing somebody into an office or picking up the phone and talking to them versus, and I believe this is evidently documented in the written record, asking one side and one side only for permission to write or amend each single word in a piece of legislation. I'm not going to engage in a debate, but those are 2 incredibly different things, and it's very disingenuous to say you speak to everyone. We've spoken to Mr. Wimsatt many times, and you've been very generous with your time, but there's a difference between speaking and listening and asking for permission. I never asked anyone on the industry or the environmental side for permission.
Dr. Finkel, we're getting a little off topic, please.
Yeah, well,
Thank you.
things were said that just weren't true. So let me get to what I wanted to talk about.
And if I may, I do want to say your characterization that the agency is asking permission is completely false and misleading, and I object to that. But why don't you go ahead with your 7 items?
Okay, well, we've both seen the same emails. Number 1, I'm pleased that everyone now seems to understand that a site-specific setback based on local hydrogeologic conditions is the only way to go. The feds and most other states figured that out a long time ago. Thank you. 2, as I think you know, others already use time of travel to justify their applications and use the conservative value or the maximum value of groundwater speed to be appropriately precautionary. Let me read you 2 sentences here. The estimate of the time of travel for groundwater about 2,600 feet down gradient is based on the following assumptions. And then it's hydraulic conductivity, horizontal hydraulic gradient, and porosity. The conductivity value is the calculated upper 99th% confidence interval for the mean of the data set. It accounts for the more permeable end of the distribution. This resulted in a calculated seepage velocity in the order of 15 feet per year and an estimated time of travel on the order of 150 years to the nearest surface water. I'm sure you know where that comes from. It's not from some other state. It's from Mount Carberry. Sevian Meehan consulting firm, 2009. So this is old stuff, and the argument that it's somehow uncertain and needs to be studied, it's already been used here and it's worked well. 3, Leah, you mentioned earlier the part, I think it's 805, that talks about the subgrade and the conductivity. I think it's good that that's always been there, but I do think the new rule needs something more protective and more prohibitive, like the main system, which uses 10 feet per year, not 100 feet per year, as an absolute prohibition, because there are not that many tracks that have that kind of porosity, and it seems sensible to rule those out from the get-go and not waste time with an application that shouldn't be presented.
1 minute.
Okay. 4, the setback needs to be circular. Otherwise, you're at the mercy of developers who will claim to know which is down gradient, which is up gradient. That's evidence-free claims, often full of surprises. Number 5, the maximum value of seepage velocity should be used. Otherwise, you're at the mercy of developers who will take a few samples, find the part of the track they like, oversample in that place, manipulate the average lower and lower until it meets the reverse engineered goal of trying to get a permit. 6, offset should be rare. In fact, I would argue that if a technology exists, the third liner, the better monitoring system, it should be required already. And don't give people a break and let them get closer to the lake or river because they're doing something they should be doing already. Finally, it would be nice, I frankly was pleased to hear, and maybe I've been unfair over the last couple years, you do seem to understand that the airport setback was revised 21 years ago. It does give the impression in the rules that you didn't get that. I understand the more strict one applies, but the state rule really should not have something that contradicts the more strict federal rule. It's a small piece, but it happened so long ago, it really would be a nice gesture to fix that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Finkel. Next, we have Elliot Wessler. Please unmute yourself. You have 4 minutes.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Can you hear me? Yeah, this is Elliot Wessler again. I've got a series of process questions that I'd like to pose to the panel, and there's quite a few. There's 5, 6, 7. If you want me to give it to you all right now or do it in bunches, just let me know, but I'll get started on it. The first set of process questions involves the outgrowth of the SB 61 hearings. If I remember correctly, I'm paraphrasing now, I believe it was DES's testimony that expertise did not exist within DES that was needed to establish, in particular, a setback standard from a perennial water body. And so one of the questions I have is, what is DES's current view on whether that expertise now does reside within DES, whether DES on its own dime, if you will, is likely to hire a consultant? And as part of that is based on the extensive testimony that was offered by many parties involving both SB 61 and HB 56, I think it's now well recognized that there's a huge body of expertise that lies outside of DES. And so the question is, isn't that a good starting point, is to tap into that expertise? And isn't a good way to do that to hold some sort of public information sessions? I also come from a federal regulatory background, and the agency that I work for used that tool all the time and extremely effectively, prior to rulemakings, we honestly wanted to know more information And we wanted to sound out all the stakeholders on what their views were, and holding public information sessions is an excellent way to do it. How about if I stop there and ask, can I come back and ask afterwards another series of process questions?
Of
That
course
work
you
for you?
can. Of course. Who would like to handle that question? Director
I'd
Wimsatt?
be happy to take that. So thank you, Mr. Wessler. So with regard to your first question, I'm not sure we ever testified that we didn't have the expertise to write the rules. I think we did express concerns during the hearings about what was being asked, the nature of the rulemaking that was being envisioned either under House Bill 56 or Senate Bill 61, and that it was a question of resources and time as well. And of course, that both of those bills did not pass, so that those ships have sailed, so to speak. But we believe we have the expertise to write these rules. We have a huge body of rules to amend. As you know, our entire solid waste rules are expiring in a year, so we're working in earnest on a number of chapters, including this chapter. So we will be doing that to the very best of our ability. We are, this session is the first opportunity for folks to weigh in on this landfill siting issue. And in addition to the testimony that we take today and the comments and input that we take today, we'll be providing a public comment period that will run through the close of business on Friday, August 4th, which Leah will be explaining the details of that before we close this afternoon's session. And so that's an opportunity for anybody and everyone. You don't have to have participated today. Anyone who wants to provide any amount, any detail of input and guidance to the agency, we will look at that. We look forward to receiving that and reviewing that carefully. And this just really represents the first informal approach to that. Once we have that information and we'll get to working on draft rules, the way the rulemaking process works, we will file an initial proposal that will be published. And then at the time of filing that, we will also schedule a public hearing. Will be more formal than this session. It wouldn't be so much back and forth, but it would be an opportunity for anyone to provide oral or written testimony with respect to the proposed rules. And then that will also be followed by a public comment period during which folks can submit written comments that we will be reviewing prior to publishing a final rule proposal. So that's how that process is likely to work. That's what will happen over the next 12 months. And I certainly appreciate, I agree with you. We really do want to avail ourselves of all the information possible. And that's in part why we decided to hold this session and the other sessions that we're having on other parts of our rules. As Leah mentioned at the beginning of this program, they're not required by law or rule, but we just think it's a helpful way, a little bit more informal way to have this kind of back and forth and to get the process started. So there will be this, there's the public comment period that follows this. And then, obviously we always are going to look at whatever is sent to us and whatever's provided to us. And then we'll have the formal hearing and public comment period that will happen likely in early 2024.
All right. Thank you very much. Next, we have Andrea Bryant. Ms. Bryant, please unmute yourself, state your name, and you have 4 minutes. Ms. Bryant, are you there?
Ms. Bryant is still muted.
Ms. Bryant, you need to unmute yourself.
Ms. Bryant, you can click the item that looks like a microphone. It's red with a line through it. And when you click it, it turns green and you'll be able to speak.
So we'll let Ms. Bryant work out some technical issues, and we'll skip Ms. Bryant for the moment, but as soon as we hear that she's back, we'll put her back into the queue. Let's move to...
Am I here? Can you hear me now?
Yep, go right ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. So it's more of a comment than a question. We know that the Conservation Law Foundation had a lawsuit with NCS because of a violation of the Clean Water Act because of seep going into the Amnesic River. So I guess my comment is that when you are determining setback, please consider that it has actually already happened where a river is getting polluted. I know the river is pretty close. The Amnesic is a designated river, and you had said earlier, I think Jamie said earlier that there was a little bit more distance. Well, obviously it's not enough. So I think that's a real scientific thing for you to look at when you are setting regulations.
Thank you, Ms. Bryant.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Next, we have Wayne Morrison. Mr. Morrison, you can unmute yourself and you have 4 minutes.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Okay, I guess this is a question primarily for Mike, but maybe Jamie as well. Mike, given the an awful lot of testimony and discussion over the last couple of years, it seems to me that it's been fairly clear that the current 200-foot setback from a perennial body of water is, although it has been the rule in place for a number of years, there's really no science behind it. It's somewhat arbitrary. And given all of the dialogue that has gone on, I think on all sides of the argument, I guess my question to you is, given the overwhelming discussion, the sentiment about the need to change that, what will the department cite another landfill, a new landfill with the 200-foot setback, or will you in fact ensure that a change will be made so that the permitting of another landfill will be based on the latest science and whatever the department's best estimate of a science-based setback would be? So I guess I'm really saying it appears that everybody agrees that the current setback is not right and it needs to be changed. And will we intersect it in time so that the department won't issue another permit under that old standard?
Thank you, Wayne. So as Jamie explained, I think very well in her introductory remarks, that 200-foot setback is a minimum setback requirement that runs in tandem with other provisions of the rule that also dictate how far a landfill could be sited from a given surface water. And in practice, those other provisions almost always result in a greater setback than 200 feet. So I don't know where we're going to land on that minimum setback, whether that minimum setback will change or not, or if it does, what number it would go to. What we do anticipate is the language that those other provisions that I'm referring to, may benefit from a little more exposition in the rules, a little bit more specific guidance on how to interpret those provisions. And I think that's where we're going to really focus our efforts. So I guess the answer is, as far as with respect, and it goes back to some of the early questions, if we get an application for a landfill, it's going to be our responsibility to review that under the law and rules that are determined to be in effect and applicable to that application, and that we'll make the decision based on the rules and the law that we're advised are apply, and then we'll make that decision accordingly.
Is it okay to ask a follow-up?
You sure can.
Related to that is the idea of a one size fits all, applies to any site. It seems there was an awful lot of discussion about site-specific requirements. And I know Jamie talked about some of the requirements are site-specific and others are generic. But from our standpoint in looking at this, it seems apparent that the soil and the porosity and the underlying bedrock, whether it's fractured or solid, is, in New Hampshire, that varies greatly, even in short distances. And so from a health and safety perspective, it seems as though, given all the other things that were discussed earlier from other people who, everything from, the capacity needs to the urgency for more capacity or whatever, it just seems this is the time to intersect it. We're at an inflection point. in decades. No, that we haven't had a greenfield new landfill in the state of New Hampshire. I don't know if anyone can remember when that happened.
Mr. Morrison, do you have a question?
Yeah, absolutely. Are we going to have a site-specific requirement for the setbacks before we issue another permit?
What I will tell you is that in our view, the rules already contain site-specific requirements. And as such, any landfill or landfill expansion sightings that have occurred have at their heart been site-specific decisions. And I would not expect that to change. The way the rules read and what they specifically require or specify is likely to change with the new rulemaking. But I would argue that even under the current rules, any decision we make about siting with respect to setback to a surface water is already a site-specific determination.
Thank you, Mr. Morrison. If you have a follow-up, please feel free to put your name in the question box and we will add you again to the queue. Next, we have Cheryl Jensen.
Hello again. I just wanted to make something clear about my earlier comments. I'm not talking about DES limiting people to whom it can speak. I'm talking about whose input gets more weight. And I used that word before, and I'm using it again.
Ms. Jensen, your comments are beyond the scope of this input session, so I just ask you to make your comment quickly so we can continue on the path of the landfill siting regs.
Well, I'm just going to say that I'm skeptical about all of this due to my experiences since 2007 in Bethlehem, when I attended every single input session about expansion of the landfill. And when we got back answers to our questions from DES, most, if not all, of our input and concerns were ignored. Thank you very much.
Next, we have Fred Anderson. Mr. Anderson, will you unmute yourself, state your name, and you have 4 minutes.
Yes, my name is Fred Anderson. A couple of things. I think it's become absolutely clear that no matter what kind of technology is employed in a landfill, it's eventually going to leak. I haven't seen any evidence that suggests otherwise in terms of all the reading that I've done since we've been talking about this. And so one of the things I want to urge the department to do is, as you're looking at your rulemaking, rather than presuming the best possible outcome of a site, consider the worst possible outcome of that site. When it fails, what's it going to impact? And if it's going to impact any of these things that are important to us in terms of water sources, et cetera, then deny the permit. That's my first request of you. And then I have a question. In the publicity that followed in the papers following the failure S61, Mr. Wimsatt, you made the point that after all, DES is a branch of the executive branch of government, not the legislative. My question for you is, what is the role of the governor in terms of your making decisions about the rules that you're going to create that are due in July, I think, of 2024? Question mark.
So thank you, Mr. Anderson. So yes, you're correct. The agency is part of the executive branch. And as such, the executive leader of the executive branch is the governor. And so the governor does, consult with his department heads, including the head of the Department of Environmental Services. And the expectation is that we're going to understand what, the governor, I think probably the place you see it most evident is that if, and we've been very clear about this, when we are testifying in the legislature about bills, we absolutely are consulting with the governor's office about what the governor's position on bills is going to be. And when we testify and we take positions on bills, those should be reflective of the governor's position on the bill. And similarly, as we do rulemaking, I mean, most governors are not all that directly involved in specific rules, but similarly, when we're doing rulemaking, the expectation is we're not going to advance a rulemaking package that isn't supported by the governor.
Thank you very much.
May I follow up?
Quickly, please. Yes.
I've, with all due respect, sir, I've watched you give testimony again and again and again on bills and make the statement that you take no position on the bill and then kind of dissect it very, very effectively in the process. But I've never heard you say you were representing the governor in this position. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Sarah Doucette. Ms. Doucette, please unmute yourself, state your name, and you have 4 minutes.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. I may be back on the list before we're done, but I have kind of a basic question that's been in my mind for years as we've gone through this long dance together. And I have heard DES say, as a bottom line, that DES follows the rules that are in place in making decisions about permits. And that has sometimes seemed like an excuse to me for making decisions that really may not be in the best interest of the environment and the people of the state. So I just wonder, I mean, if you have a rule, say you do get an application in the next 12 months before you've finished your review process, I mean, if you feel you're making an unconscionable decision for water protection, in other words, that following the rules is going to leave the state dangerously vulnerable to a proposed development, I mean, do you feel your hands are tied, or do you have some wiggle room to do what in your hearts and your experience you know is best? I mean, where do we go from there if you don't feel good about where the regulations are? Do you have any wiggle room between now and July next year?
Ms. Doucette, I think that question's been asked and answered, but I would just be interested to see if Director Wimsatt or Jamie have anything to say before we move on.
I mean, I know, like I said, I've heard this, but I'm still not so clear about.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that. Thank you, Ms. Doucette. So, you know, the answer is when we are presented with an application, our job as an agency is to review that application against all the law and rules that apply to it. And if it meets all the law and rules, then we have a responsibility to typically, you know, issue the permit. If it doesn't meet them, then we have a responsibility to deny it. And we've done both of those things in this program over the past. And with respect to your question about, you know, I actually think that the rules currently in place do a very good job in protecting both the surface water and groundwater quality of the state. The evidence bears that out. And, you know, basically, there are some rules that go into a decision about a landfill permit is a complex one. There are a lot of rules and requirements, both in the law and in the administrative rules that apply to it. Many of them, or most of them, I would even say, are pretty kind of digital. They're the yes or no, you either meet it or don't. There are some that are a little more subjective, so that's where some of the difficulty comes in, and there's a little bit more room for, you know, judgment and discretion. But in general, it is stated very simply. It's somewhat clinical. When we get an application, we review it against all the applicable law and rules, and we make a decision about whether it's approvable or not.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Doucette. Next, we have Representative Haskins. Representative Haskins, please unmute yourself.
Okay.
You can hear.
Thank you. I am also a member of Environment and Ag with my colleague, Jim Creighton. It's been a steep learning process in my first term. But as I told my colleagues in the legislature, I am not new to environmental activism. And I think I am going to get to a question. I think that it is extremely important to me that we conduct ourselves much like Mr. Wimsatt believes, Director Wimsatt, in an ethical and forthright manner. And he and I have had that conversation. I think he knows where I stand on that. I wonder if it's an appropriate question to ask Mike, why do you think SB 61 failed?
It's a fair question to ask. I'm not sure it's necessarily appropriate for me to try to answer that. It failed, and I guess what I would say is that I want everyone to understand the agency takes its direction under the law from the legislature.
Right.
And there was a lot of direction that we were going to get under Senate Bill 61, but we did not get that direction because it did not pass. And so what we're focused on right now is we have rules that are going to expire in 1 year, and we're working on doing the very best we can to listen to the public, to write rules that we think help us achieve our mission, and that's what we've got our heads down, and that's what we're going to be doing.
I appreciate that. May I tell you that from my perspective, as part of the leadership of the defeat of SB 61, it was because we were concerned about transparency and ethics. And I want always the conversation and the relationship that your department and the committee I serve on to be respectful. But we were told that it wasn't about a particular landfill and it wasn't about a particular bill. And then we read the Concord Monitor. And we learned from others that that was necessarily not the whole picture. And I think the bill was defeated soundly 238 to 134 for that reason. And although we were told, if you don't pass this bill, we'll have nothing, I don't think I could believe that you and your colleagues want any less protection than the rest of us do as residents of New Hampshire and as people who recognize that people come here for the lakes and the rivers and the mountains and the beauty of the state. So I guess I just wanted to say, and I think that Cheryl was misunderstood in her comments, and I think she tried to clarify that we want the people whom we represent to have the kind of agency that others who have titles and salaries have. And I think that that's our job. So without belaboring it, that's where it is for me. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you, Representative Haskins. And if I may, I will tell you that everybody on this call and all of their colleagues, Leah, Jamie, myself, absolutely come to work every day with the primary goal of achieving our mission of protecting public health and the environment. And that, despite what may have been written by some or said by others, that is the truth. And we will continue to do that and work very hard to write the very best rules that we can prepare.
Thank you. Next, we have Elliot Wessler. Please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I have my laptop on. Hang on a second.
Volume down, Fred.
I'd like to thank Representative Haskins for her measured comments. And maybe say to Director Wimsatt is perception sometimes is more important than reality. And adding on to that is people have different realities. It was pretty clear to the public that that as Assistant Commissioner Sanborn testified, not all stakeholders had an equal opportunity to shape SB 61. But the thing that I wanted to talk about is kind of to follow up on Wayne Morrison's comments is given all of the discussion over the last couple of years, and particularly this year, about SB 61 and HB 56, let me pose this question. It seems to me it would be an extremely good idea for DES in review of its setback from perennial water in particular, to just adopt some of the principles, particularly within HB 56. Seems like that's a very useful starting point for DES to consider how to revise the setback rule. And along those lines is, I know that DES testified that it had particular problems with some of the principles in 1454, some of the principles in 56. It seems to me that those problems are easily overcomable. And I want to point to one is one concern that DES had was that given a 5-year time distance traveled standard, that maybe too much land area within New Hampshire would in effect be taken off the table. And there was concern about a map showing soil and hydrogeological conditions. So a question I have is DES going to go back and rethink that concern? And in particular, if there is, it could be with any standard, not just a 5-year distance travel standard, that too much land would be taken off the table. So it seems to me it behooves DES to try to think through, the balancing of interests between what will eventually, maybe in 11 or 20 years, depending on how you count, a need for a new landfill and maintaining health and environmental quality. Another thing I want to raise is
Mr. Wessler, your time is up. Mr. Wessler, your time is up at the moment.
You, Director Wimsatt, had with John Swan.
Mr. Wessler?
The NCS landfill has had a very checkered past. The largest leachate spill in New England, I think.
Mr. Wessler?
Within the last year or two, is there are significant concerns about groundwater contamination. And this also goes back to a discussion that you, Director Wimsatt, had with Sarah Doucette at the first.
We're going to ask Mr. Wessler to re-enter his name so we can get him back on the list. But I do believe he asked one question. I'm not sure if anyone's prepared to answer that at the moment. But if not, we're going to move on to Dr. Finkel, unless, Mike, you had a response to his initial question.
Yeah, I guess what I would say, if I understood it correctly, he was asking whether we would incorporate various principles that were part of HB 56 into our rulemaking. And, I guess what I would say is that we're looking at all options. There are many things on the table right now. We've not put the pen to paper on these amendments, so I wouldn't rule anything out necessarily. But I would note that HB 56, along with Senate Bill 61, were not passed by the legislature. So I think some have sort of said, well, if it almost passed, then that's direction to the agency, but or if it was discussed. But the reality is, the point I was trying to make before is that we take direction from the legislature in one way, and that is when bills get passed that amend the law to give us guidance and direction. And in this case, nothing passed in this session. So we've not been given any specific directives or guidance by the legislature. But we're listening to legislators now along with the rest of the public, and we are going to use all that information that will inform the work we do to amend these rules.
I'd just like to remind everyone, I want to try to gently steer us back to the specific topic of the landfill siting rules themselves, and we're still very interested to learn from you all some ideas relative to the rules themselves, knowing where we are in the legislative process at this time. Next, we have Dr. Adam Finkel. Dr. Finkel, please unmute yourself. You have 4 minutes.
Hi, thanks. I appreciate now a third bite at the apple. I have a question. I do think I need to preface it a little bit with a comment. So if I had had more time, I don't want to take it now to spend a little more time on the last couple of suggestions I had in round two. Two of them were about, I hope you will shape the rules so that you are not required to rely on representations from the developer about things that you really can't verify. So for example, I think the setback should be circular. I don't think you should rely on someone's representation that there's a down gradient direction and an up gradient direction, and you can have a non-circular setback. Similarly, with maximum value, the beauty of the maximum value, not only that it may in fact be less protective than the upper bound on the mean, and I can send you the math on that if you want, but it can't be disputed. In other words, once you got the maximum, that's a real data point, and there's nothing wrong with using it. You don't have to rely on an average that can be manipulated. So anyway, my question is, I've always meant to ask this: what is the capacity of the agency to take a multi-hundred-page application that's full of site-specific data that someone else has collected? Do you have any independent ability, legal authority, and resources to quality control that data? In other words, if someone says, here's the hydraulic conductivity, have you ever or could you ever go on site and try to corroborate that information?
There is some basis for the agency to, make use of resources to try to evaluate and verify data. So yeah, that's a potential option.
You have 2 more minutes, Dr. Finkel, if you want to ask your second question.
Oh no, I didn't have one. That was a short answer, but yeah, I would encourage you, if you do have those resources the next time around, not make any implications, but there's a lot of numbers and data in an application, and one would hope that they're all correct, but also that they have to be interpreted, especially if you allow an average. You need to be able to verify that that's a representative average and not an oversampled average designed to achieve some goal. And I do think the balance here is, I think we're on the same page, that we're trying to encourage more site-specific, let's say, bearing in mind your earlier comments, but a more site-specific evaluation that requires more information, and therefore more ability to not just use a cookie cutter. Are you 200 feet away? We put out a measuring tape, and that's a yes or no. But are you 5 years away, or 2 years away, or 12 years away? That's more complicated, and someone will have to decide whether that time-based setback can be independently verified. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Finkel. Next, we have Wayne Morrison. Mr. Morrison, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me again? Yep. So I guess I'll circle back to Jamie started with kind of going through the rules and some of the complexity that you all talk about. And I think as somebody that's kind of been drawn into this process, I certainly acknowledge how complex this whole thing is and the difficulties in managing all of that. I guess my question and a comment relates to the way New Hampshire does site qualification, both in terms of timing and also in terms of transparency. It appears that a landfill permit application takes a very long time to snake its way through before a decision is made. I know Maine has bifurcated the process in terms of site qualifications is then separate from actually the landfill build and execution and running. I guess the question I have is, would DES consider modifying how it qualifies sites and somehow or other move that earlier up in the process? From a public standpoint, it's very unclear to us if a site meets the requirements or not, and how long it takes into the process before a decision is made. And I'm wondering if you would consider modifying how you do that and how you communicate that both to the applicant as well as the public, because it's a point of great concern, and I think it causes issues in terms of how we feel about the process and understanding of it. So I'm just wondering if, I don't know from your perspective, but certainly from my perspective as somebody in the public, it's not clear to me why we can't qualify or disqualify a site very early in the process so we know whether that hurdle's been crossed or not, and why, versus waiting a year and a half and finding out, yeah, we're going to go through, we're approving the permit. I think the public, from a public perspective, we would have more respect and more, we would understand the process and feel better about it if we had that more front end loaded. And I wish ask you, I guess, if you could just comment on that.
Mr. Morrison, I just want to give you a general answer. That's the exact reason why we're having these public input sessions, is to get ideas like this. So when you ask, will the department entertain? This is your opportunity to ask us to entertain. So we would entertain very much you putting that in writing so that we can delve into the question at that time. But I'm happy to defer to Jamie or Mike if they have an answer right now.
Mike's been talking a lot. I'd like a shot. So thank you, Mr. Morrison. It's a great question, and we have thought about that before. The process that we have now has been in place a long time, and we may not have taken a critical look at that question in the past, or something we've wanted to do. And because our whole body of solid waste rules has to be readopted basically at the same time, we've not really had an opportunity to dig into that. It is definitely something we're thinking about. It's something we're considering, and certainly welcome to submit comments on that, like as Leah mentioned. And Mike, I don't know if you want to add more.
All right, great. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Next, we have Cheryl Jensen. Ms. Jensen, please unmute yourself, and you have 4 minutes.
Yes, as this process and as these changes go forward, I would just like to check on something about the DES's mission statement, which, to just shorten it, and I think this was said before, protect public health and the environment. But back in 2007, when I was at a New Hampshire Association of Conservation Commission annual meeting, then Director Thomas Burak said something about that public health included a strong economy, and that those two things were not mutually exclusive. I mean, I happen to think they are mutually exclusive, and that perhaps some other state government entity takes into consideration the economy. So all these years later, I'm just wondering about that. And again, I keep asking about the weight of things and the preference of things. So I'd like to know where perhaps where DES's role in a strong economy comes into making these changes.
And again, Ms. Jensen, I apologize, but I think your question again is kind of beyond the scope of what we're trying to focus on here. I won't pretend that any of the three of us speak in totality for DES's speak to the DES's mission. So I'm going to respectfully ask that we keep moving on to Mr. Wessler.
You don't think that any of you speak to the mission? Did I get that wrong?
No, what I was saying is I don't believe that any of us speak for former Commissioner Tom Burak.
If I
Mike,
could add
sure.
to that, Leah.
Yep.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. I mean, that is, I worked under Commissioner Burak for many, many years, and that was a message. It was, to be clear, it was not stating that was DES's mission. My recollection, and I won't go any further in speaking for him than to say this, is that what he was trying to point out is that a strong economy and a healthy environment, I think is the way he typically put it, were not mutually exclusive, and that they could go hand in hand, and that they should go hand in hand. He was not, for a moment, I never took it or never understood it to mean he was amending our mission. Our mission statement was developed under Commissioner Burak and remains what it is today. So I guess that's all I would have to say about it.
I certainly hope so. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Elliot Wessler. Mr. Wessler, please unmute yourself, and you have 4 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Elliot Wessler again. I'd like to talk about the level of public participation that will occur between now and issuance of a final rule. I think everybody has said that this session is not required by rules, and for that, on behalf of the public, I'll say thank you. But my concern is that this is a forum that really doesn't lend itself very well to not only back and forth between the public and DES staff, but also to, sort of getting a resolution to how DES is making decisions based on public input. And if I understand the process as you've outlined it correctly, is you're likely to write draft rules. You will accept public, you're accepting oral comments now, you will be accepting written comments, you will be issuing a draft rule. But that draft rule is, if I understand correctly, extremely unlikely to go through the series of public comments and sort of call balls and strikes. This was good, we adopted it. This was not good, and for this reason, we're not adopting it. That is not the way rulemakings are done at the federal level. And this is an issue that's been brought up to DES on several occasions, is the public would have a lot more confidence in DES's really its interest and its sincerity in listening to and considering public comments if there was some evidence that public comments were in fact reviewed and considered. I fully believe you when you say that every single written public comment will be read, but that really doesn't help with, kind of the credibility of DES's staff's willingness to consider those comments. So I would ask you to inject more opportunities for some give and take between the public and DES staff. In particular, I think if that draft rule in January included at least some summary of what the public said, what was adopted, what was not adopted, and why, is the public would have a lot more confidence that DES is in fact working on behalf of the public, as well as on behalf of industry, which is unfortunately a perception that is very
1
much
minute.
taken hold within the public.
They're going to say they do already.
Mr. Wessler, I believe you outlined the steps pretty accurately about the rulemaking process. So there will be a draft rule created after this public input session and a public comment period. We will draft rules, and there will be another more formal that's laid out by statute and by rule, a formal process to. Gee whiz, I guess my time is up. Okay, to take in comments, and then like I said, we anticipate having all the rules in place in July. As to the amount of information that we share based on how we came to conclusions, that's something that we can certainly look at as we are revising all of our rules at the moment. So thank you for your comment. I appreciate that. Next, we have Fred Anderson. Mr. Anderson, will you unmute yourself, state your name? You have 4 minutes.
Can you hear me? Okay.
We can.
Fred Anderson. Mr. Wimsatt, you warm the cockles of my heart when you tell me that first and foremost, your concern is for public safety and for the safety of the environment. And I really want to take you at face value there. And so I thank you for that. I want to say something about the two bills in the last 2 years that have come forward. You made the point that you take your marching orders from the legislature. On the other hand, you're listening to the public. Let me ask you to think about House Bill 56 and House Bill 1454 as having come from the public. They didn't land in the legislature by themselves. They were drafted by us, we the people, a group of us concerned about these issues, and we are bringing them to you again and simply saying, please, as your team of experts, take a look at your rulemaking, listen to what we're saying, take it into your consideration, and do your very best with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Next, we have Sarah Doucette. Ms. Doucette, please unmute yourself, and you have 4 minutes.
Thank you. I asked this question in an earlier session and was told that you had some concern about it, but it wasn't necessarily at the top of your list. And I mean, that may have pertained to what the topic was that day, but I'm still concerned about the evaluation of your developer, landfill developer, and that developer's record for compliance and safety. And I mean, my question then and now is, it seemed, and you agreed, that there were not very objective standards as to X number of violations or certain types of violations would preclude someone having a permit in the future. And you acknowledged, of course, that's a difficult thing to objectify, and there is a lot of subjectivity in it. But can you say any more about that in terms of our being assured that a developer really is someone we can trust to do the very best of your standards and the industry standards in terms of compliance and going the extra umpteen miles to protect the environment and the public?
I think I'll just try to answer that by echoing Director Wimsatt's statements earlier that you know our charge is to follow the statutes and rules that we are required to follow, as well as our applicants and any of those involved in landfill or other solid waste facility development. So I'm not really sure how else to address that question. I believe you did ask that question last time, and we kind of provided the same answer.
Can I follow up briefly?
Sure.
I mean, I do certainly accept that you have regulations that you're directed to follow and do follow and that guide you, but it sounded to me like there was really a lack of guidance for you in this area. And I wonder if there's any intention to address that. I mean, I think you said that previously when we were talking.
The conversation isn't ringing a bell.
Leah, I think this was when we were talking about the 300 rules in the public input session for 300. It's not really related to the citing rules. And I think I would just refer back to that conversation we have. I don't think anything's changed since we discussed that.
But I mean, if the site is not going to be secure if it's operated by somebody who's not up to the task. I won't belabor this, but I think it's very pertinent to citing and to permitting people.
It's absolutely pertinent to permitting. I hear you. It's just covered in a different chapter of our rules. That's in the 300 chapter. It does lay out certain standards that somebody needs to make, but as we discussed before, some are objective and some are subjective, and it is tricky.
Well, we'll keep that on a burner then. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Ms. Doucette. I don't see anyone else who has placed their name in the question box in order to ask a question or provide a comment. I will hold this session open for another moment. Ms. Doucette. If you would like to speak again, please unmute yourself.
Okay, here we go. So just a closing statement here, and this really reflects back on some earlier comments by a couple people, and Adam comes to mind, particularly about the fact that you've really got a lot of value decisions ahead of you, and that it is value decisions that will drive your new regulations. And I think this was underscored by the debate in the House Committee on Senate Bill 61, which showed different sets of values and very different degrees of desire for true water protection by various stakeholders. So I think there's a lot of disagreement about the level of protection that the public wants compared with the industry and other parties. And I'm going to read you a one-sentence quote I came across this week. It was from Orwell in 1939. He said, "We have now sunk to a depth at which the restatement of the obvious is the first duty of intelligent men," and I would add women. And so the restatement of the obvious here is the ubiquitous and devastating PFAS contamination that's swirling all around this conversation. And the infinite value of excellent environmental protection is a standard that I ask you to hold as your highest value in this process going forward. There is simply nothing that should override the importance of our water and our environment for our ongoing wellness. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for using a different way to restate DES's mission. We fully understood.
Good.
All right, well said. Now we have Julie Seeley. Ms. Seeley, please unmute yourself, state your name, and you have 4 minutes.
Oh, wait. Sorry, Julie, I could not find your name on the list. You're on here twice.
Okay, sorry. Took a bit there. My question relates to storm events, which are referenced fairly frequently throughout Chapter 800 of the Solid Waste Rules. And I would personally like to suggest that DES revisit those very, very carefully, that DES note the extreme weather we've been having in New Hampshire, and that leachate, various water overflows, et cetera, being calculated based on 25-year storms is, I feel, problematic. And I think DES needs to look very, very carefully at what current weather patterns are, and not only what the typical 100-year storm now is, because it's very different from what it was even 15, 25 years ago, but whether even using a 100-year storm at this point, given the acceleration in weird storms and weird weather, is adequate for protection of groundwater. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. It is very, very timely, and it is something that we've started discussions on. So if you have specific thoughts, please send them via email to us, and we will absolutely take them under consideration. All right, seeing no one else who wishes to provide comments, I'm going to prepare to close this session. Again, we will ask that you submit written comments to DES by 4 p.m. on Friday, August 4th, 2023. And again, those can be emailed or submitted by mail, and directions for submitting written comments are provided in the notice for this session, which is posted on the DES website. And the email, again, is swmbrules@des.nh.gov, and submit those comments by 4 o'clock on Friday, August 4th. And I really appreciate all the time you've taken today to participate in this public input session, and we really hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.